Today we're continuing our focus on legacies and futures. Many of you are aware of this already, but I will say that during John Cobb's last months of life, he had certain things he wanted to communicate. And one of those is that he hoped that people would focus on the future, or that in his death, he really wanted himself to be decentered, and he wanted the attention to go to the future. He had huge confidence in the people who attend Cobb and Friends, people who are doing amazing work in their various locales and various areas of interest. And he also had hope that everyone would stop and be aware that the future is calling. And the future is even more urgent than he realized at that time, because the world and the United States have escalated in their dance with danger. So our focus is on legacies and futures, looking at the promises of process-relational philosophy for a transformed world, looking at the present, looking at the challenges, the past, the challenges before us in the present, and the future that draws us or lures us forward. Our speakers today are really superb folks. We are so lucky to have this panel. Many of you will know the people because all three of them have presented in Cobb and Friends before and in many, many other places, and you've read their books, but let me introduce them anyway. Matt Segall taught process philosophy and science with us last year. He is always a huge help in trying to dig deeply into the sciences, both the physical and the social sciences. And he convenes and works with groups of scientists of all varieties in their work. And much of Matt's more recent work is applying process-relational thought across the natural and social sciences, as well as a study of consciousness. He is associate professor in the philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness department at California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. And he's the chair of the Science Advisory Committee for the Cobb Institute. He blogs regularly, and you can go to his blogs. He also is a fascinating speaker. Matt, thank you so much for being here with us today. Tom Ord is also with us today, another compelling speaker, very much in demand. His theme is remembering our initial feelings when planning for the future. And what I didn't do is to name Matt's theme, and let me go back up to it. And
sorry,
Matt's theme
I jumped the
is,
gun.
no problem, the ongoing immediacy of John Cobb's objective immortality. Tom is focused on the feelings, the initial feelings when planning for the future. Tom is a highly influential theologian, philosopher, and scholar of multidisciplinary studies. He directs the Center for Open and Relational Theology, which he founded, and he directs doctoral students at Northwind Theological Seminary. He's an award-winning author and has written or edited more than 30 books. Very productive. A gifted speaker, Ord lectures at universities, conferences, churches, and institutions. He's known for his contributions to research on love, science, and religion, open and relational theology, the problem of suffering, and advocacy for the full inclusion of queer people. I do want to add that Tom is a person who lives his life so fully with such integrity that he has suffered the consequences of it. Most recently, he's been removed from his church's roles and from his role as an ordained minister. So he has accepted those consequences as part of what it means to advocate, to care for and with others. And our third speaker, another very gifted speaker. I sound like a broken record today, but his is Andrew Davis. His theme is Emerging Trajectories in Process-Relational Philosophy. Andrew is an American process philosopher, theologian, and scholar of the cosmos. He quickly points us beyond the earth to the cosmos. He is the research and academic director for the Center for Process Studies, where he researches, writes, teaches, and organizes conferences on various aspects of process relational thought. He also organizes conferences on a wide variety of topics, and he's very good at that. Imaginative, efficient, and a strong leader. As an advocate of metaphysics and meaning in a hospitable universe, and he approaches philosophy as the endeavor to systematically think through what reality must be like, because we are a part of it. He is author, editor, and co-editor of nearly a dozen books, including Mind, Value, and Cosmos. On the relational, the subtitle of that is On the Relational Nature of Ultimacy. Another one of his books is Cosmology, New Integrations in Science and Philosophy. And the third book is Metaphysics of Exo-Life, Toward a Constructive Whiteheadian Cosmotheology. This work is fascinating, and he is a very clear interpreter of that work and the works of others who are interested in these subjects of metaphysics, meaning philosophy of cosmos. So now I end my words and turn this over to Matt with one more comment about you, Matt, and that is that you have been doing some very fascinating work on world soul. And with that, I'll just turn it over to you and can't wait to hear what you're going to say.
Thanks, Mary. So the title of my remarks, I want to add an extra word in there just for emphasis. The ongoing subjective immediacy of John Cobb's objective immortality. That's not a mistake that Mary made or anyone else that left it out of the title. I just realized that I wanted to add it in this moment. And I want to speak about how we relate to the so-called dead. And I don't want to focus overly on John because I know he didn't want us to talk about him too much. But this isn't about John as an individual. It's more about how his example can live in us and in our work today. And the real point is what lived in John and still lives through him, I would say. And for him, that was the Christ or the Logos. And I think at that level, I'm not so much here talking about John, but the Christ in John and in us. And it's through that energy of love that his work continues to act through us creatively. And for John, of course, I was just reading his book from the 70s, 76, was it? Christ in a Pluralistic Age. Of course, Christ is a name that suggests something religiously exclusive, but this was not at all what John intended and what process thinkers intend. Christ refers more to a creative power of love, but also an agent of transformation that John even identified with art, an agent of artistic transformation, but a form of artistic transformation that required or presupposed a kind of dynamic, trustworthy love, as he put it. And I think that we urgently need this agency, whether we call it logos, whether we call it the initial aim, the primordial nature. in Whitehead's terms, or an agent of artistic transformation. I think we as human beings, individuals, and communities, we urgently need this sense of both a source of refreshment and inspiration and relevant novelty, and a sense that there is a companion, a fellow sufferer who understands what we're going through. And I think in John's life, the potential of this sort of creative agency was embodied in both his thought and his action. In that book, Christ in a Pluralistic Age, John was observing two struggles that I want to emphasize, that I think are very much still with us. They're still our current struggles, 50 years after he wrote that text. One is this struggle for sources of historical hope, as he referred to it. Historical hope would be um, our sense that the future is open and that our human actions can shape it. And I think we're at a moment now when socially and ecologically, it's very difficult to have that kind of historical hope. I think many of us feel powerless. We feel like it's too late. We feel like we're too small and weak. Our um, agency is too dispersed and fragmented. And so we need to recover a sense of historical hope. John also spoke about the importance of finding sources of motivation as individuals. Many people are struggling with a lack of meaning, a lack of purpose, finding it difficult to find reasons to act in a world that feels so um, fragmented and disillusioned. So how do we find historical hope? How do we find sources of individual motivation? And I want to really emphasize the spiritual potential of process thought here. I mean, I think many of us in this Zoom room have been inspired, um, by John, by David Ray Griffin, by so many other process theologians, and by Whitehead directly. But I think there's still some work to do to translate those ideas into a living spirituality. And I want to speak to that a bit in the remainder of my time here. Um, so if John's life provides us with an example of how this um, transformative agency can work in our individual and collective lives, um, we can also see how using Whitehead's understanding of objective immortality, John, and in John, the logos working in John is still with us and alive in our present subjective experience. And John was obviously a kind, thoughtful person, and he did profound philosophical and theological work. And it was that energy of transformative love in him that I think allowed him to so fluidly bring together the fragmented disciplines of modern universities, art, science, religion. Um, he so easily seemed to see how they could be brought back into a mutually enriching dialogue. And I think there's much for us to learn from that example. Whitehead has a picture of God with both a primordial nature and a consequent nature. Logos may be a better name for the primordial nature of God, which is that which is, again, this transformative agency that inspires us with possibilities moment by moment. But there's also this consequent nature, which is that sense of companionship, of a fellow sufferer who understands. And it's this sense of companionship that gives us a worth, a feeling of worth beyond ourselves, right? And so we can find a sense of motivation as individuals, but if we are inspired by this logos, by this transformative agency, then the work that we do as individuals is always for others, right? It's for our sense of worth beyond ourselves. Whitehead says in Process and Reality that no actual entity can be conscious of its own satisfaction. And what does that mean in this case? No actual entity can be conscious of its own satisfaction. So each actual entity is inspired by this initial aim from the primordial nature of God, from the Logos. But then we have this subjective aim that receives and can be embraced or can embrace that initial aim, or it can go its own way. We're all self-creating, right? But as we achieve our satisfaction, that sense of aesthetic um, joy of having, achieved a new novel value never before seen in the universe. That value that we achieve is not actually something we can be conscious of as individuals. It's something that we achieve to give to others. And I think uh, John, in exemplifying how this creative, transformative agency can work in the world, could not himself be conscious of his own satisfaction. That is for us to be conscious of, right? And that is how we can be inspired by John, by the Logos in John, to continue this work in the world and ourselves to be of service to the future, right? Because no actual entity can be conscious of its own satisfaction. The satisfaction is for others to incorporate into their consciousness, and so on down the chain of creative inheritance. So if we understand John's life from this view, John being objectively immortal, he's objectively immortal in the subjective immediacy of our own feeling of this, the potential of this creative agency. So his life's work can qualify the creativity that we inherit to provide us with material to continue to do this work. And so he continues to work in us. We continue to work with him. We can be conscious of John in our work and of the Christ in John. So there's no static legacy here, right? We can find a sense of immediate joy in what we have learned from this man and the example that his life serves for us. And I think hopefully in here there is a source of um, renewed historical hope and a source of individual motivation. Um, I think the individual motivation piece is easier for those of us who had a relationship with John or who have some deep spiritual sources um, to draw upon. But in terms of this renewed historical hope, I feel like that's where the real challenge is here. Um, Communities like this one are hard to come by, and I think we can continue to set an example for the rest of our species um, to build bridges. I'm very inspired by the work that the Center for Process Studies is continuing to do with China. I think that's very important to assure that we can move forward into a more peaceful future where um, we imagine that human agency has a role to play. We're increasingly, I think, dwarfed by the power of our machines, by the power of technology, by the blowback from centuries of greenhouse gas emissions. Nature itself is becoming, in a sense, hostile to the human presence on this planet as a result of our own actions. And so there are so many reasons not to have hope in the future. But the work that we're doing, the work that John did for so many decades, I think is a source of potential that we can continue to realize in the present as we look to to transform this world. But it's a difficult task. I'm glad we have each other, and I'll leave my remarks at that and pass it on to Tom, I believe, is next. Is that right?
Thank you so much, Matt. You've gotten us started really well. Let's turn to Tom.
Thanks, Mary Elizabeth. I would like to encourage us today to put ourselves in the past, go back to our former selves, and try to remember what we were thinking and how we were feeling when we first encountered process thought, open and relational thought, relational theology, whatever label you want to call it. For me, I first encountered it as an undergraduate student. I had been raised in an evangelical home, was a avid evangelist, and then no longer saw the point of belief in God at all and moved to atheism. My return to belief in God was in part influenced when I decided to do a little study of natural theology and went into the little card catalog, they had those back in those days, of my little college and pulled out everything on natural theology. And one of them was a book by Charles Hartsord called A Natural Theology for Our Time. I do not claim to have understood what Charles was saying when I first read that book. But a few years later, when I was in seminary, I got more acquainted with this process theology ideas, and the emotions that welled up in me were so positive. I want to return that to those in a little bit. But I began the process then of going deeper and reading more. And of course, in those days, there was no internet. So it mostly meant going to card catalogs in a good library and reading journal articles and books. And I just found myself enveloped in this wonderful world and started learning new language like prehension and perception in the mode of causal efficacy, and started wondering about multiple ultimates. And I saw this development in me because I craved more sophisticated language and sophisticated ideas to answer my deepest questions. But along the way, I often found that I was using language that my wife, the people in my church, my students eventually had no clue about. And I worried that I was not able to give to them the positive feelings, the intellectual satisfaction that I had received. And so today, what I would like for us to do is put ourselves in our old shoes and think about what really turned us on when we encountered process theology, relational theology, again, whatever language you prefer. As I was thinking about preparing this exercise, my mind went to an obscure biblical passage that I memorized in my youth from the wild and woolly book of Revelation. And I'm going to share my screen now so you all can have access to this. Here's the biblical passage that sprung to my mind when I was thinking about what I'd like us to do today and remembering our past. It says this. This is a letter to a church in Ephesus, and the writer says, I know that you are enduring and bearing up for the sake of my name, and that you have not grown weary. But I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love you had at first. Remember then from where you have come. Repent and do the works you did at first. A few years ago, I was trying to write an introduction to open and relational theology, and I thought it would be wise at the beginning to describe some of the ways people have come to this way of thinking, some of the means, the experiences, the thinking. And so I ended up briefly describing 12 ways. And as I read through these, I wonder if some of them, probably more than one, might be influential in your own finding of process open relational theology appealing. First of all, for many people, it just fit what they'd already been thinking and feeling. So often when I speak in a public place, people come up to me afterwards and they say, "Oh, what you said fits what I've been thinking and feeling for a long time. I just couldn't articulate it in the way that you articulate it." For some people, it was this reading of the scripture, in my case, the Christian scriptures, that I just thought there's so many connections between the general way I think God is described and the general way we ought to act as believers or followers of Jesus, and the themes, the central themes in open and relational, or at that time I would call it process theology. This was also a way for some of us to come in and take seriously the deep held values about our lives and about the world that other theological or philosophical systems just didn't seem to manage well. For some of us, and it was our studies in the social sciences, especially psychology, that brought folks to think we need a philosophical and theological framework to capture what seems to be fundamental truths that aren't captured so well in more deterministic scientific assumptions. Some people, and many of these I've noticed in my life, they're more often women than men. They see that this particular way of looking at reality embraces the central relational themes they find in their own lives and in the world. And I suspect the number one reason, at least most people I run into who have been attracted to process theology or open and relational thought, it's their wrestling with the problem of evil. Why would a loving and powerful God not prevent, not stop the genuine evils in my life and in the world? So there are six, and here's another six. Some of us, it was the themes of Jesus, that brief Galilean vision that Whitehead talked about, that we just thought, okay, this way of thinking fits with what we think Jesus is all about. For others, and earlier in my life, this was a big thing. It was the science and religion discussion. Jim Miller was talking before most of you got on that this was really instrumental in his own search for ways to bring together these two fundamental domains in our lives. Others, I think of Charles Hartshorne and some like him, who had a more philosophical, analytic philosophical bent, and they could talk about this being that than which nothing greater could be conceived in process language. Still others, it was art or various artistic sensibilities that brought them to process or open a relational thought. This is a way of life that actually makes sense of our quest for meaning, that gives our lives purpose. And that brought some to this way of thinking. And then finally, this has probably been the most important for me, although I could probably point to all 12 of these at certain times in my life as being important. But this last one, I had this deep sense that God existed and God was a God of love, and all the ways that God had been talked about in my church and in my seminary classes that ran against God as loving, I found solutions to them in process relational thinking. I remember as a seminarian, as I began to delve deep into these issues, I read all kinds of journal articles from John Cobb and Marjorie Suhaki and Mary Elizabeth, many people who are on this call, and those then. I have distinct memories of being in the library and having these certain feelings come over me. And I'd like to describe 6 of those feelings. So these are the things I felt when I first encountered what at that time I would call process theology. First and foremost, I just felt free. It was like, my chains fell off. I felt like all of the baggage I was carrying, which was mostly probably intellectual baggage, but some emotional as well, was just gone. This was a new way to think that just made sense. And I was now free from, I mean, not free entirely, but at least I didn't have to take as seriously some of the crap, what I thought was crappy theology that I had been given. I also felt intellectually affirmed because I had gone from a very pietistic, revivalist kind of faith community and then moved into academia and learned about Aquinas and Paul Tillich and all the sophisticated language that I was very attracted to, but it didn't seem to fit my intuitions. And then along comes process theology that's got some sophisticated theological and philosophical framework, but also could fit these intuitions I had about love. And so there was this deep sense that, hey, my thinking is validated in some way. Also, I remember feeling opened up. I could now think seriously about my Buddhist friends. Actually, at that time, I had very few Buddhist friends, but in theory, I was learning about Buddhism and interacting with people from other faith traditions. And I now could be open to them in a way that I wanted to be open, but I thought that theologically was not permissible. Another feeling I had, I was a rebel. That feeling probably has never left me. This sort of going against the status quo that I thought was causing so many problems and still think causes problems. And this sense of righteous rebelliousness or loving rebelliousness, another major feeling for me. I also felt like this was a way that I was now connected not only to other people, but to animals, to the planet, and of course to God. So this framework provided the feelings of connection that I had not experienced previously. And then finally, for me, um, I started to have a feeling that not only does this framework point to the purposes of life in a way different from purpose as understood in my earlier days, but also not just in general purpose, but that I, as an individual, had particular purposes. In fact, some of those purposes involved trying to relay or relate or portray this way of thinking about God and reality to others in ways that they would understand. And that, as I think about moving forward as the Cobb Institute, as the Center for Open and Relational Theology, as individuals, as I think about the future, I want to constantly ask myself, Tom, what was it in the beginning that you felt and thought? Because it's likely that other people have those same kinds of feelings and thoughts when they first encounter this way of thinking. So, my question for us as I conclude is this: what from the past, our first loves, to use that biblical passage, should we remember as we strategize for our future? Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tom. Andrew.
Well, thanks very much, everybody. It's great to be here, see you all. And thanks, Matt, and thanks, Tom. Tom, we've all benefited from your rebellion, I think, in important ways. And when you said, this notion that you're not a sanctioner of the status quo, I think immediately of Cobb and Griffin's early introduction to process theology. I think it was maybe the mid 70s even, or maybe a little after, where one of the main tenets they put forward was God is not a sanctioner of the status quo. So interesting. Well, what I want to do today, and in lieu of the topic, the theme, which I love, this theme of legacies in the future, is focus a little bit on the future, and do so by commenting, at least in part, on what I discern to be some recent or renewed trajectories for the process movement. These are trajectories of research. They're trajectories that involve what I would say are a number of emerging allies for us. That is to say, people whose work is deeply relevant to the kinds of orientation the process movement has towards the world, even if they're not strictly informed by Whitehead. So what I discern, and I think it's a good thing, is a certain readiness of the culture that we're now inhabiting for these kind of ideas. And I want to point to a few of those different orientations here today. So, but I want to say first something about the metaphors that we use for the process movement. Of course, we use all different types of excellent metaphors. I think of one that Jay McDaniel has often used, which I like a lot, the metaphor of a tree, the growth of a tree, essentially from the roots to the trunk to the branches. It's a naturally organic metaphor that is great, and in fact, it's one Whitehead even uses at the end of Science in the Modern World. I think it's page 206 or 9, where he's talking about the interdependence of the environment in contributing to the growth of a single tree as a part of a wilder forest, and the role of the rain and the role of the microbes, the role of the wind, etc. And so it's natural for us to use the organic metaphor, but how I'd like to frame some of my comments today is with a different metaphor. And it's one I've been thinking through a little bit as I'm coming along to finish at least the first draft of my new introduction to Whitehead's thought, and I hope to finish that in a month or two. And this metaphor comes from someone who knew Whitehead perhaps better than anyone else. In fact, someone who slept right next to Whitehead, and that was his wife, Evelyn. And it is pronounced Evelyn, I learned, by the way. We were happy to meet George Whitehead, Whitehead's grandson, at Harvard some months ago. And when I was speaking to him, he corrected me. Usually spoke of Evelyn. He says it's Evelyn. So as a reminder. So this metaphor comes from Evelyn, and I really love it. So I want to read to you her quote about Whitehead's thinking. And then from there, we'll sort of broaden this metaphor out. And I want to comment for a few minutes on some of the emerging trajectories of the process movement. So here's Evelyn Whitehead. She says, he, or his, that is Whitehead, his thinking is a prism. It must not be seen from one side alone, but from all sides, then from underneath and overhead. So seen as one moves around it, the prism is full of changing lights and colors. To have seen it from one side only is not to have seen it. So I think this is a beautiful prismatic metaphor, and it's a wonderful way of entering into Whitehead's mind, certainly. But even more than that, if we broaden it out, I think it's a beautiful way of beginning to think about the process movement as a whole, as multi-sided, as spinning with light and color. And although Whitehead himself, to my knowledge, doesn't ever use the language of prism, he does say that the how does he put it? The task of reason is to fathom the many-sidedness of things. And so I think as a process movement, we are absolutely many-sided in nature. We're prismatic, and this metaphor is helpful because the prism collapses if it's not upheld by the different sides. And so each side is also transparent. It's an avenue of transparency into seeing the other side from a different perspective. And so I want to think with us about this spinning prismatic metaphor as I now mention just a few different sides or trajectories of that prism. And if you want, they're interdisciplinary sides of this prism. And as mentioned, I want to just mention a few allies as well as a part of the larger process movement. So one of the sides or trajectories of this prism would be a neuroscientific side. Very exciting. And some of you will know that we've been engaging the work of Ian McGilchrist, whose work I think really constitutes one of the most significant emerging Weltanschauungs, if we can put it that way, in a number of years. His hemisphere hypothesis, of course, we don't need to go into much of that now, but is really an amazing entry point into a kind of process-relational worldview. And indeed, I'd say a process theological worldview. And so Matt and I were happy to host a great conference at Center for Process Studies and the California Institute for Integral Studies on Ian's work to flesh out what some of those connections were. And Matt and I are now in the process of working on an edited volume from that conference, which would allow more access to these meeting of process-related minds in the context of neuroscience. So I think he's one very important side, and not just him, but the neuroscientific side of the prism is something that's very important. And his fame actually helps the process movement, not because we want to get famous ourselves, but because he's an example of the wider reception of process relational ideas. And I think that's something we want to certainly pay attention to. Now, the prism shifts. Another side that's worth mentioning is the biological or maybe the biophilosophical side or trajectory of the process movement. And another ally I think that has to be mentioned is Michael Levin's work, theoretical biologist at Tufts University, who is doing fantastic work at essentially pushing the boundaries and the extent of intelligence, agency, and mind in nature. And I'd say in ways that are deeply amenable, at least at an initial level, with process conceptualities. What I love about Michael's work, and Matt, you can certainly comment on this too, is that he's not afraid to ask robust philosophical questions as well. So some of his recent work is on the necessity for a kind of Platonic-like morphospace that's active and relevant to the emergence of organisms and possibilities. Something that's resonates with process thinkers, the role of possibility in nature, from bottom to top, as it were. So Levin's work is someone we need to pay attention to. Matt's been in dialogue with him, which is great, and we'll be publishing some of his work in the McGilchrist volume. Another name would be John Dupre, who recently gave the Gifford Lectures, and the title of those lectures were A Process Perspective on Human Life. Someone whose work is certainly wider than Whitehead, but again, an ally in helping a kind of cultural shift toward a more process-oriented worldview. So another side then would be the philosophy of mind side, or trajectory. And of course, any number of people could be, scholars could be mentioned. I think Philip Goff is an interesting voice. Durham University philosopher of mind. He's responsible, at least in part, for a certain revival of panpsychism. And Philip is really interesting because he's gotten there essentially independent of certain process avenues that most of us have taken through Whitehead, through Hartshorne, through James and others. So, and that's fine. That's great. He's an example of the emerging popularity of a view that for decades has been seen to be an anathema. And just by way of example, a few years ago, his book Galileo's Error made the prediction that in 10 or 20 years' time, panpsychism would be a mainstream kind of perspective. The irony is, of course, Griffin made the same prediction just 20 years before Goff did. And of course, before Griffin, there was Hartshorne, there was Whitehead. So this is significant for us as a movement because it's the return of the primacy of mind in different ways. And Matt and I are beginning to forge with colleagues a Mind at Large project at the Center for Process Studies, which would again to retell the story of how mind is re-entering our worldviews in a deep and significant sense. So this is, again, the philosophy of mind side, very important for us. Okay, let's move the prism slightly. Another side, the cosmological side. I've been following closely, as some of you have, the brilliant findings, photography coming from the James Webb Space Telescope, which is an encouragement for us to keep our imaginations alive. The effects are not settling in just yet, but some are suggesting that this is going to challenge our dominant cosmology in ways that are perhaps unforeseeable. So the adequacy, for example, Big Bang cosmology, whether this is on sure footing or whether it's being questioned. And I know Tim Eastman is here with us. Hey, Tim. Tim and Matt have discussed this, but they're not the only ones that are pointing to potentially certain holes in our cosmology. And I think James Webb Space Telescope is one way of opening certain holes and asking us to think again. And of course, related to that are questions of time and its primacy. Lee Smollen's work. Lee is arguably an ally in this regard as well. And what this means for the laws of nature, the so-called laws of nature. And indeed for life beyond Earth, this question of astrobiology, which I've been enjoying researching for some time, where, for example, our recent text that came out with Lexington is a contribution from a process perspective on these larger issues. So again, the cosmological side is very exciting. Just a few more I want to mention. Another side of the prism, another trajectory, the existential side. And Matt, I think alluded to this a little bit. So we're in, I would say, a cultural moment that's being described in different ways: the meaning crisis, the poly crisis, mm, existential risk as a way of naming a certain trajectory of ecocide and planetary destruction, which is possible for us. And we face the question of how we're going to respond to this, and how we respond to the fact that many people are facing a kind of meaning crisis. One way I think we shouldn't respond to it as philosophers is to take a perspective like an anti-natalist perspective, as it's called, from David Benatar, which is essentially the perspective that it is immoral to bring human life into being, immoral to have children. Or somebody like Yuval Harari, who, despite his very attractive books, holds a deeply nihilistic worldview, which I think is inadequate. And so the point here is combating this existential side of this prism, this meaning crisis, and figures like John Vervaeke, who is a colleague and friend of ours now, is doing excellent work on that. Vervaeke is informed by Whitehead, at least to a certain extent. And this whole desire of reawakening the ancient meaning of philosophy as a guide for life. And Whitehead is very speculative, but I think there's work to be done on the practical philosophical praxis as informed by Whitehead's thinking. So the existential side. One way of responding to the existential meaning crisis is through the exceptional side of the prism. Okay, we spin again. So there's a lot of tremendous research going on, and historically there has been, about whether it's psychedelic experience, psi phenomena, paranormal phenomena, increasingly now UFO or UAP phenomena, which has been a part of the process tradition. I think of Griffin's wonderful text, which was diving in at a certain level to the parapsychological world and the relevance of Whitehead's thinking for that. And of course, William James was involved with that as well. And so there's likely a connection between psychical research through James and to Whitehead, although to our knowledge, Whitehead himself didn't write much on that. But we have many allies in this side of the prism, the exceptional side, from Peter Sajdet-Hughes, who's doing great work in psychedelics, Edward Kelly in transpersonal psychology and near-death experience, Alex Gomez-Marin, working on all different contours of paranormal phenomena. And it might be tempting, I think, to say that this exceptional experiential side of the prism is a way of responding to the existential meaning crisis side of the prism. And I think that's true in part. Experience can help us transcend certain crises of meaning. I think the risk in that is that these experiences aren't linked to a kind of tradition, and that may or may not be a good or bad thing. But I do think it's important to embed these kinds of experiences, if possible, within a larger religious or theological frame and tradition. So that would be the another side, then, the final side of the prism I want to mention today, the theological or spiritual side. So I would suggest that the spiritual side is a way, and perhaps the way, of responding to this meaning crisis. And again, I'd say the moment we're currently in is ripe for this. It's an anatheistic moment. Anatheism is a term that Richard Kearney had put forth. The prefix ana means a returning to. So anatheism is a returning to God after God. So our moment, arguably, is a moment after atheist rejection and just before a kind of reawakening of the sacred, albeit we know not what. So arguably, there's a cultural shift back towards a certain interest in Christian faith. We've seen this at different levels, and regardless, I'd say, of thoughts about, Jordan Peterson or Jonathan Pageau, whatever you think of them, they're contributing towards a certain reawakening at symbolic and psychological levels of Christianity. And even somebody like Richard Dawkins, who says he's a cultural Christian, or Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a long advocate of atheism who's now converted to Christianity. And even Philip Goff, who I mentioned earlier, who's found his way back to an affirmation of Christian faith that is amenable to a process theological conception, although I think he's a little hesitant about putting it that way. So all this to say is that this theological or spiritual side of the prism, as Tom was emphasizing, is very important. Are we undergoing a kind of new reformation, as Whitehead's anticipated perhaps 70 or 80 years ago? Chapter 10, Adventures of Ideas. And what does that new reformation look like? What does it mean to contribute to a return to God? And how, and what are the contours of that discussion? I think that this spiritual or theological side is perhaps one of the most important. And of course, Tom's doing great work on that. I anticipate doing further work on a more robust presentation of process theology myself in the future. And the last thing I'll say is that we are prismatic people in the process movement. And we'll recall Griffin and certainly Cobb's hope that the 21st century might be a Whiteheadian century. And I think the soil is ripe for that. And I am encouraged by the shifting and opening of culture in different scientific, existential, philosophical directions. And I hope that moving forward, we can continue to make that Whiteheadian century a reality, at least in a certain sense. So I'll stop there and look forward to dialogue with everyone.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Andrew. And now let's